I want to fix her pipes, but she wasn't done with me yet. The day had started like any other, with a quiet sense of routine. I was halfway through breakfast when my phone buzzed, a call about a plumbing issue at a house I'd never visited before. As a young plumber in my mid-20s, I'd handled countless calls, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way she described the problem over the phone, polite, precise, yet with a faint lilt of amusement in her voice, as if she already knew I would be walking into more than just a minor repair. When I arrived, the house immediately struck me. It wasn't grand in the ostentatious way some people think of, but it carried a quiet elegance, warm, muted tones, sunlight spilling through tall windows, and the subtle aroma of something baking in the kitchen. I felt my chest tighten slightly, not from nerves, but from an odd sense of anticipation, the kind that comes when you know a day might change without warning. She opened the door before I could knock. She was in her early 40s, with an effortless grace that caught me off guard. Her hair, chestnut with hints of gold in the sunlight, fell naturally around her shoulders. Her eyes, calm yet curious, studied me briefly before her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "You must be the plumber," she said, her voice warm but teasing. "I hope you don't mind a little chaos." I introduced myself, fumbling slightly as I took in the details around me, the careful placement of books on the shelves, the art on the walls, the faint smell of coffee mixed with something sweet, like vanilla or cinnamon. She stepped aside, letting me in, and the air felt warmer here, both literally and in some unnameable emotional sense. The conversation started as work talk, practical and polite, but I noticed the little things. The way she tilted her head when I explained my approach to fixing the pipes, or how her fingers lingered on the doorknob as if reluctant to let go. She made a passing joke about my toolbox, how impressive it was, and I caught a flicker of amusement in her eyes that made me smile despite myself. There was a rhythm here, an unspoken curiosity, like we were both aware that something unspoken was beginning to form between us. As I knelt by the pipes, checking the valves and leaks, I could feel her presence behind me without needing to look. When she handed me a wrench, our hands brushed ever so slightly. Just a fleeting touch, but enough to make my pulse hitch. I caught her glance, and she didn't look away immediately, just held it a beat longer, a silent acknowledgement that neither of us was entirely indifferent. Even the mundane details seemed to hum with subtle intimacy, the faint warmth radiating from the sunlight on her skin, the soft rustle of her movements as she tidied nearby, the quiet rhythm of my work punctuated by the occasional shared laugh. By the time the first pipe was fixed, the day had shifted. The ordinary task of repair had quietly transformed into something more, a first thread of connection, delicate but undeniable. As I packed up my tools, she lingered in the doorway, offering a small, half-teasing remark, "You're good at this, but I think I might need more than just your skills." And for the first time that day, I felt the hint of possibility, a slow, electric tug of curiosity and something more. By the time I knelt beside the second pipe, the initial awkwardness of our first meeting had begun to ease into something lighter, more natural. She hovered nearby, not hovering in the annoying sense, but present in a way that made the space feel warmer, more intimate. There was a rhythm forming between us, the casual exchange of tools, the little jokes, the quiet observations that felt significant. "I can't believe how careful you are with these," she said, tilting her head slightly as she watched me tighten a valve. "Most plumbers just hammer through." Her voice was light, teasing, but there was curiosity underlying it, a genuine interest that wasn't easy to ignore. I smiled, caught off guard by her attention. "Careful is better than messy," I replied, brushing a stray lock of hair out of my eyes as I worked. "Besides, I like knowing things are done right." She lingered near the counter, occasionally offering a towel or handing me a small tool. Every interaction was charged subtly, a brush of fingers as she passed something to me, the way she leaned just a fraction closer when speaking. I found myself noticing details I wouldn't normally catch, the softness of her sweater against her skin, the way her earrings caught the sunlight, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the warm, earthy smell of the pipes. We laughed together over small mishaps, a stubborn bolt, a dropped wrench, and each laugh seemed to stretch, filling the kitchen with a lightness that contrasted with the practical task at hand. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, how her lips curved in an amused smile that seemed both inviting and teasing. I caught myself stealing glances when she wasn't looking, wondering how someone could seem so confident yet quietly approachable at the same time. At one point, she gestured toward the sink, and our hands met briefly as she handed me a rag. The contact was fleeting, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but enough to make my pulse hitch. I felt her presence linger, even when she stepped back, and I realized I was acutely aware of every movement she made. The conversation drifted naturally from the work at hand to lighter, more personal topics, favorite books, music, little anecdotes about the house she lived in. She revealed just enough to hint at her personality, witty, insightful, yet touched by a gentle vulnerability that invited trust. I found myself wanting to listen, to linger, to know more. Even as the pipes came together, the practical task became secondary. The space between us seemed to hum with possibility, quiet tension building in the most ordinary ways, the brushing of hands, the shared laughter, the moments where our eyes met and held just a heartbeat too long. By the time I finished the final adjustments, the air felt charged with unspoken understanding. She looked at me with a small, enigmatic smile, and I caught a glimmer of something more than gratitude, curiosity, perhaps even a spark of desire that neither of us yet named aloud. As I packed my tools, I realized that fixing her pipes had been the easy part. The real repair, it seemed, was of something more subtle, a bridge forming between two lives, delicate and tentative, yet undeniably there. And as I left, I couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning, that our story had quietly shifted from a simple service call into something far more complicated, far more intriguing, and far more intimate than either of us expected. After the pipes were fixed and the clatter of tools had quieted, the house settled into a soft, almost reverent stillness. I started to pack up, but she motioned for me to stay a moment longer. "You don't have to go just yet," she said, her voice calm but carrying a warmth that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. We ended up sitting on a low bench near the window, the golden afternoon light spilling over us, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. She didn't rush into conversation, instead letting the quiet stretch, comfortable yet charged with unspoken anticipation. I found myself watching the way her fingers rested lightly on her lap, the subtle shift of her weight as she leaned slightly forward, her gaze occasionally drifting to the view outside before returning to me. Eventually, she spoke, softly, almost hesitantly. "I don't usually invite strangers to sit with me like this," she admitted, a wry smile touching her lips. "But you feel different somehow." There was no flirtation in her words, only honesty, and something vulnerable beneath the surface, a quiet crack in the otherwise poised exterior she wore so effortlessly. Her confession sparked a subtle tension in the room, one that didn't need to be named. I listened, leaning back slightly but not turning away, aware of the way the warmth of the sunlight mingled with the warmth of her presence. "Different how?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle, not wanting to disrupt the fragile intimacy settling between us. She sighed, a soft sound that seemed to carry years of quiet frustration and unspoken longing. "I've made mistakes. Trusted the wrong people. Sometimes I forget what it's like to let someone see me without the mask," she said, her eyes meeting mine in a moment of unguarded truth. It was fleeting, but it lingered, heavy and real. I felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness, a desire to respond, to ease her vulnerability without overstepping. "I'm not here to fix you," I said quietly, with careful sincerity, "but I'm willing to listen if you want someone to." My hand rested loosely on the bench beside hers, just close enough that our shoulders almost brushed. She looked down at the gap between us, then back up, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension wasn't about desire, it was about connection, the slow recognition that we could share something meaningful without needing to define it yet. Our eyes met again, and I noticed the slight softening around them, the way her lips twitched as if fighting a smile, the subtle flicker of curiosity and trust. The house around us seemed to fade away. I became aware of the small details, The faint scent of her perfume lingering in the sunlight, the quiet hum of the city outside, the way the warmth of the bench seeped through my jeans. A hand gesture, a slight shift closer, a glance held just a second too long. These tiny things carried weight, more than words ever could. By the time I finally stood to leave, there was a sense of subtle transformation between us. What began as a simple service call had quietly evolved into a connection that neither of us could ignore. She offered a small, almost mischievous smile. "I think I might see you again," she said, her tone light, but her eyes lingered on mine in a way that promised more, not just another visit, but something deeper, waiting to be discovered. I was just about to shoulder my toolbox and step toward the door when she spoke again. "Wait," she said, her voice soft, but carrying a quiet authority that made me pause. She leaned against the door frame, arms loosely crossed, watching me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. "I thought maybe you could stay for a little while longer." The words hung in the air, casual on the surface, but weighted underneath. My heart skipped, and I felt an unfamiliar tug of anticipation mixed with hesitation. "Stay?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant while every part of me betrayed my curiosity. "For dinner," she added, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Or at least until you're ready to leave. I could use the company." I hesitated. It wasn't just the suddenness of the invitation, it was the subtle intimacy it implied. Her home, her presence, the way she looked at me now, as if evaluating not just my response, but my character, made my pulse quicken. I nodded slowly. Sure, I'd like that," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my mind was racing. She smiled, and it was different this time, warmer, more inviting, as if a door had opened, both literally and figuratively. She stepped aside, letting me into the kitchen, and I noticed the way the sunlight filtered through the window, casting her hair in a warm, golden halo. Every small detail of her presence seemed amplified, the gentle tilt of her head, the way she moved with effortless grace, and the quiet confidence that seemed to wrap around the room like a soft blanket. As she bustled around the kitchen, I caught glimpses of her vulnerability between the poised gestures. She hummed softly, a tune that felt oddly familiar, and offered me a glass of water. Our hands brushed briefly as I took it, and the contact lingered just long enough to make my pulse spike. I felt the electricity of proximity in the ordinary act, the warmth of her hand against mine, the slight tremor that accompanied the small gesture. Conversation flowed naturally as she prepared a simple meal. She asked about my work, my day, my family, and I noticed the gentle attentiveness in the way she listened, the way her eyes met mine when I spoke, holding my gaze just a second longer than expected. There was a rhythm to our dialogue, playful but intimate, filled with pauses that allowed the tension to settle comfortably between us. At one point, she gestured toward a pot on the stove, and I moved closer to help. Our shoulders brushed, and I felt a quiet warmth spread through me. She looked up, her eyes catching mine, and held the gaze a fraction too long before glancing away. The unspoken acknowledgement of our connection hung there, fragile yet undeniable. The kitchen smelled faintly of garlic and herbs, mingling with the lingering scent of her perfume. Every detail, the clatter of utensils, the warmth of the sunlight, the soft rustle of her movements, made the world around us fade just slightly, leaving only the two of us suspended in the quiet intimacy of shared time. By the time we sat down to eat, I realized that the simple invitation had transformed the dynamic between us. What had begun as a professional encounter had subtly evolved into something more personal, more vulnerable. The day's work on her pipes was now just a backdrop to a deeper, more delicate connection, one neither of us had yet named, but both of us felt with growing clarity. And as she laughed at one of my clumsy attempts to pour water without spilling, I knew this was more than a dinner. It was an opening, a chance for something unexpected to take root, and neither of us was in a hurry to let it go. Dinner had long ended, but neither of us seemed ready to leave the quiet cocoon that had formed in her living room. The warm glow of the lamps painted soft shadows across her walls, and the faint scent of herbs from the meal lingered, mingling with the subtle perfume she always seemed to carry. The room felt intimate, yet comfortable, a space where ordinary silence carried extraordinary weight. We sat on opposite ends of the sofa at first, yet even across that small distance, every glance, every movement felt loaded with unspoken meaning. I noticed the way her eyes caught mine when she laughed softly at something I said, how her lips curved ever so slightly as if she wanted to linger in the moment, but was holding herself back. It was a tension I could feel as much as see, a quiet pull, delicate but persistent. At one point, our conversation drifted into lighter territory, childhood memories, favorite movies, little anecdotes that revealed subtle facets of who we were. But even in laughter, there was something beneath the surface, a hesitation, an almost imperceptible pause before we spoke, as if both of us were testing the waters of intimacy without admitting it. There were small, charged moments throughout the evening. When she reached for a throw pillow, her hand brushed mine lightly. My pulse skipped, and we exchanged a fleeting glance, both of us aware of the electricity in the simple contact. Later, as she handed me a mug of tea, our fingers touched again, longer this time, just enough for warmth to pass between us. Neither spoke of it, yet it shifted the air, making the silence feel more like a shared heartbeat than empty space. I found myself hyper-aware of every detail, the soft rhythm of her breathing, the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, the warmth of the blanket draped over her lap. I noticed the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the quiet way she shifted closer to the edge of the sofa without quite leaning toward me. It was all deliberate and unintentional at the same time, a dance neither of us had rehearsed, but both were perfectly attuned to. Emotionally, I was in turmoil. I was drawn to her confidence, her grace, the quiet vulnerability that peeked through the edges of her composure. At the same time, I was painfully aware of our age difference, the social perception of our connection, and the uncertainty of what she truly wanted. Yet none of these thoughts dimmed the magnetic pull I felt whenever our eyes met or our hands brushed. She, too, seemed conflicted. I could see it in the brief hesitations in her gestures, the way she would hold my gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary before looking away. There was a desire there, subtle and restrained, tempered by caution and perhaps the memory of past disappointments. By the time I finally stood to leave, the tension had reached a silent crescendo, a charged pause suspended between farewell and something more. We exchanged a lingering look, and in that gaze was acknowledgement, unspoken desire, mutual curiosity, and a budding connection neither of us could yet define. Even as I stepped toward the door, I felt the quiet pull of her presence behind me, like an invisible thread tethering us together. The night outside was calm, but inside, something had shifted irrevocably, the slow burn of connection had deepened, and neither of us was untouched by it. The evening had grown quieter, the outside world fading into a muted hush as night settled around her home. The soft glow of the lamps cast gentle shadows across the room, giving everything a warm, golden hue. We were sitting on the sofa, closer now than before, though neither of us had crossed any explicit line yet. The air was thick with unspoken words, small touches, and lingering glances. She picked up her tea, her fingers brushing mine as she handed it to me, and for a moment, the brush of skin felt like a spark igniting a current between us. I caught her gaze, and there it was, that subtle shift, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. She sighed softly, setting the mug down with deliberate care, as if preparing herself for something she hadn't said aloud yet. "I'm not done with you yet," she said, her voice light and teasing on the surface, but carrying a deeper, undeniable weight underneath. The words hung in the space between us, charged and intimate. My heart skipped a beat. There was no ambiguity in her tone. She was aware of her feelings, as uncertain as she might be, and she was daring me to acknowledge mine. I swallowed, feeling the rush of conflicting emotions, anticipation, nervousness, and a warmth that spread through my chest. "Not done with me?" I repeated softly, almost to give myself time to absorb the truth in her confession. My voice was calm, but my pulse betrayed me. "Yes," she said, leaning back slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I've felt something since the moment you walked in. and I can't just ignore it. I don't want to. Her eyes met mine with a directness that left me momentarily speechless, open, vulnerable, and daring me to respond in kind. I felt a careful but irresistible pull toward her. I felt it too, I admitted, my voice low and sincere. From the first moment I was here. You're unlike anyone I've met. And I can't stop thinking about it either. The words were honest, heartfelt, and carried the weight of everything we had shared over the past few hours. For a long moment, neither of us moved, the silence filled only by the soft hum of the night outside and the faint ticking of a clock. Then, almost imperceptibly, we shifted closer. My hand brushed against hers, lingering this time, a deliberate connection that spoke louder than words. Her fingers twined slightly with mine, a silent acknowledgement of mutual desire, trust, and curiosity. The closeness between us wasn't urgent or desperate, it was deliberate, intimate, and YouTube-safe. A small hug, a hand resting lightly on her shoulder, or our knees brushing as we sat side by side, each touch carried meaning, conveying more than 1,000 words could. There was a quiet joy in our shared vulnerability, a comfort in knowing that our feelings were reciprocated even without physical declarations. We spoke softly, sharing small confessions, gentle laughter, and the kind of honest conversation that builds emotional intimacy. The world outside ceased to exist for those moments. It was just the two of us, suspended in warmth, trust, and the delicate promise of something deeper. By the end of the evening, the tension had transformed into connection. The spark had settled into a quiet flame, steady and inviting. She leaned slightly against me as I prepared to leave, a subtle but unmistakable sign that whatever began as a plumbing call had evolved into something profoundly human, tender and unspoken, yet fully understood. The evening had softened into a gentle hush, the golden glow of the lamps casting long shadows across her living room. I stood near the door, toolkit in hand, but neither of us was in a hurry to break the delicate spell that had formed between us over the course of the day. The house, once just a place needing repairs, now felt like a sanctuary of connection, a quiet stage for emotions that neither of us had expected to find. She moved closer, her hand brushing lightly against mine as if testing the space between us. I noticed the subtle warmth that lingered from our previous touches, the way her gaze softened in the dim light, revealing both curiosity and vulnerability. "I'm glad you stayed," she said quietly, almost as though confessing to herself as much as to me. I smiled, feeling a rare mix of exhilaration and calm. "I'm glad I did," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. In that simple exchange, all the tension, hesitation, and unspoken desire of the past hours found its release. The air between us was charged, yes, but it carried a warmth, a promise of connection, of shared understanding, and of something more waiting to unfold. We lingered in the quiet, speaking softly about little things, the smell of the evening air, the subtle sounds of the city outside, and the lingering aroma of dinner that had faded into something sweeter now, like the memory of our time together. Each word, each pause, each glance felt intimate, as though the world outside no longer existed. At one point, she reached for my hand, her fingers interlacing with mine just enough to communicate what words couldn't. The contact was gentle, deliberate, and entirely YouTube-safe, yet it conveyed everything: trust, warmth, attraction, and the quiet thrill of connection. I held her hand lightly, feeling the weight of the day's emotions: curiosity, admiration, vulnerability, and a subtle romantic tension that had finally found acknowledgement. She looked up at me, her eyes glimmering with both amusement and sincerity. I really wasn't done with you yet," she said, her voice soft, almost teasing, but laden with truth. I chuckled lightly, though my chest tightened with emotion. "Good," I said simply. "Because I wasn't done with you either." For a long moment, we stood there, close but not rushing, letting the warmth of proximity speak for itself. Her hand slipped from mine to rest briefly on my shoulder, a quiet gesture of comfort and intimacy. I leaned just slightly toward her, careful, respectful, but fully aware of the emotional closeness that had been built. The connection wasn't just physical, it was a shared recognition of trust, affection, and the slow, subtle spark of romance that had grown naturally over hours, words, and small touches. Finally, I turned toward the door, lingering in the doorway just long enough to catch one last smile. She returned it, a mixture of playful mischief and gentle vulnerability, and I stepped outside into the calm night. The air was crisp, but I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, the warmth of connection, of shared moments, and of a story that had quietly and irrevocably changed both of us. As I walked away, I knew the day's work had been more than just pipes repaired. It had been the beginning of a bond that neither of us could ignore, subtle, sincere, and alive with the promise of more. And though the future was unwritten, the present moment was enough, a quiet, satisfying resolution, leaving both of us with hearts stirred, smiles lingering, and a gentle hope that this slow-burn connection was only just beginning.